They called it the forgotten serial murders of Widow Holloway, a 19th-century nightmare buried under snow, silence, and shame. But the ground never forgets, and neither does the house. The locals still call it Holloway House, though no one dares get close enough to see if it's even standing. Just a skeletal frame in the woods of northern Vermont, hidden off an old coach road that no longer shows on maps. The roof caved decades ago. The chimney leans like a broken spine, but the bones of the place, stone, wood, foundation, are still there. And even in summer, it's cold around the ruins. Bitter cold. The kind that sits beneath your skin and whispers that you don't belong here. The kind that knows what happened. Eleanor Holloway lived here in the 1870s. A widow. Strange. Self-sufficient. Her husband had drowned in the river under questionable circumstances, and she never spoke of him again. After his burial, she lit her lantern each night and kept it glowing through the darkest winters, an inviting signal for any lost traveler, coachman or merchant braving the frozen pass. But it wasn't a gesture of kindness. It was bait. Over 2 winters, people vanished. Not one, not 2. Whole families, hardened men, women with infants, wagons found abandoned, horses returned alone. The snow covered what needed to be hidden, and the silence of Belgrave kept it buried. Because the town would rather believe in wolves and blizzards than in a quiet woman with steady hands and patient eyes. It wasn't until the spring thaw returned a boot with a foot still inside that anyone dared question what might be happening behind that polite door. What they eventually found in her cellar, what they pulled out of crates soaked in salt and secrets, was beyond horror. And by then she was gone. Her footprints ended in the middle of a frozen river. No body, no answers, just the unmistakable echo of something that had been allowed to feed for far too long. The town tried to forget, tried to burn the memory, the records, the name. But stories like hers rot beneath the surface. They wait, and every so often they breathe again. No one who crossed that threshold ever came out alive. Belgrave was the kind of town that winter forgot last. Tucked between 2 nameless ridgelines in northern Vermont, it existed in a hollow where snow clung to the ground long after neighboring villages had thawed. There were no rail lines, no proper roads, just frozen trails carved by wagon wheels and boots. By 1870, the population had shrunk to under 300, and most families stayed not out of pride, but because they had nowhere else to go. The church bell hadn't rung in 5 years. The graveyard had more names than the census. The townsfolk of Belgrave didn't talk much, and when they did, it was never about what they couldn't explain. Eleanor Holloway arrived in 1868 with her husband, Thomas, a tall, sharp-jawed carpenter with strong hands and few words. They purchased a patch of land at the edge of town, near the timberline where the trees grew so tightly they whispered against each other in the wind. She dressed modestly, attended church exactly once, never gossiped, never complained. The kind of woman you only noticed because of how easily she could disappear into a room. The kind who seemed like she'd been waiting here long before anyone else arrived. 2 winters later, Thomas Holloway was found dead in the river. His boots were still on. His coat was missing. His skull had split on the rocks. But there were no signs of a fall. Just a long, quiet current, and a body drifting face down as if it had been placed there gently. Eleanor didn't cry, didn't ask questions, didn't want anyone to walk her home after the burial. When the priest offered to stop by with firewood, she politely declined. "I'll manage," she said, and she always did. The town whispered, of course. They said maybe Thomas had gone mad, maybe she had helped him along, maybe grief made her odd. But no one investigated. Because in Belgrave, you didn't point fingers at widows, especially not ones who kept to themselves, paid in cash, and never asked for help. And so the widow was left alone at the edge of the woods, where the smoke from her chimney never stopped rising, even when every other fire had gone out. In the 19th century, Winter in northern Vermont wasn't a season. It was a predator. It didn't arrive gently, and it didn't leave without taking something. The snow came fast, thick and hungry, swallowing trails, silencing rivers, and turning familiar paths into white voids. In places like Belgrave, where towns were stitched together by dirt tracks and muscle memory, to be caught in a storm was to vanish. People didn't walk outside after dusk in December. They didn't trust frozen bridges, and they certainly didn't wander near the ridgelines where the wind came down like a blade and the snow fell sideways. But there was one house that still showed a light. Eleanor Holloway's lantern became a legend before the killings ever began. On nights when even wolves stayed curled in their dens, her window glowed orange through the trees, steady, calm, unwavering. It was a strange kind of comfort for the desperate. Coachmen spotted it from the ridge and knew they were close to shelter. Travelers lost on the pass told stories of following that flicker like a lifeline. It promised warmth. It promised safety. It promised survival. But promises rot. The first disappearance was a logger named Harlan Fisk. Mid-30s, wide-shouldered, last seen heading toward Belgrave with a satchel of wages and a bottle of rye tucked under one arm. He was supposed to deliver supplies to his cousin's farm, just past the Holloway property. He never arrived. A week later, his horse was found wandering along the tree line, reins tangled, hooves bloodied from ice. The satchel was gone. The bottle lay shattered in the snow. Townsfolk assumed wolves, or whiskey, or both. Then a week passed, and another man vanished. Then a third. Each one was last seen near the same stretch of road. Each one had passed by the Holloway house. Each time the lantern had been burning. But no one made the connection, not out loud. To accuse was to act. And in Belgrave, people didn't act. They endured. It was easier to believe the snow had teeth than to wonder why the light in that window never went out. And easier still, not to ask who the light was really for. The first name they remembered was Malcolm Reed, a tinsmith from Montpelier, who passed through Belgrave each season with his mule cart stacked high in clinking wares. He was known for his cheer, his honesty, and his stubborn refusal to let winter slow him down. In early December of 1873, he left the southern depot with the intent of reaching the ridge before the snows locked it in. Locals remembered him laughing, swearing he'd beat the storm. "Just got to make it past the widow's house," he said. "Her lantern's always on." And then he was gone. 3 days later, his mule was found near the edge of the Holloway woods, tethered to a split fence post, reins dragging, coat slick with frost. There was no cart, no Reed, just frozen hoof prints leading nowhere, and the animal trembling with wide, wet eyes. A trapper brought it into town, and for a moment there was talk. Then came the snow. 8 inches in a single night. By the time anyone considered a search, the trail had been buried. The silence returned. The town blamed the storm, or wolves, or the kind of misfortune that fell on men who underestimated the ridgeline. They said Reed must have wandered off drunk, frozen in the dark, or fallen into a ravine. No one asked why his mule had been found so close to Holloway's land. No one wondered why she hadn't said anything. When asked casually, Eleanor only tilted her head and said, "I never saw him." No one pushed further. But one boy did speak up. Thomas Elridge, thicker. Martin claimed he'd seen the cart heading toward the Holloway house that night. He said he saw the light flicker, said he saw her open the door and smile. And the next morning he saw the cart again, empty, rolling back down the hill by itself. His father told him to shut his mouth. The town moved on. The mule was sold. The snow kept falling. Reed was scratched from the depot ledger and written off as a loss to the cold. And in the window of that crooked little farmhouse, the lantern kept burning, patient and still, like something waiting to be seen again. He was found at dawn, barefoot and bleeding, staggering down the center of Belgrave's main road, with his hands wrapped around nothing, and his mouth frozen open mid-scream. Samuel Breyer. 14 years old. The frost had blackened the tips of his fingers. His lips were split. His eyes looked somewhere behind you when he spoke, and for hours he couldn't stop shaking. At first they thought he'd fallen through the ice or run from wolves, but what he said, when he finally did speak, was something else entirely. He said he'd gotten lost the night before, separated from his uncle's wagon during a snow squall near Holloway Ridge. The wind was too thick to see, and just when he thought he'd collapse, he spotted it, a lantern glowing in the dark. He knocked, and the widow opened the door. She didn't speak at first, he said, just stood there with her head tilted, like she was listening for something else behind him. Then she stepped aside, and he entered. The fire was already lit. Soup was already on the stove, and the table was set for two. She served him bread, warm and sweet, sat across from him and stared while he ate. Her eyes didn't blink. Her smile didn't move. And the whole time, she said nothing. When he asked where her family was, she looked past him and said, "I keep quiet. They don't like noise." That night, she let him sleep in a cot by the parlor stove. He said he woke twice, once from a dream, once from a sound. The second time, he swore he heard someone or something beneath the floorboards, breathing, slow, labored, followed by the unmistakable sound of nails dragging across wood. When he looked toward the cellar door, he said it was open just a crack, and something had moved behind it. He ran, out the window, through the trees. No coat, no boots, just snow and screaming until someone heard him. The doctor said he was delirious. The priest said the devil finds easy homes in frightened boys. No one believed him. But 3 weeks later, when the river ice cracked open in the thaw, something drifted to shore, a man's boot, and inside it, still curled and frozen, was a foot. While the town whispered and the snow kept falling, Eleanor Holloway never changed. Her fire burned steady, the smoke from her chimney rising each morning like clockwork. She fetched water from the well before sunrise, chopped wood behind the barn with slow, clean strokes, and swept her porch even when no one walked it. The routines never broke. Her clothing never changed. Her face never aged. And no matter what rumors stirred in the tavern, or what boys dared each other to peer through her fence, she remained exactly the same, polite, distant, untouchable. She would nod to passers-by, offer the occasional wave, but her voice rarely left the house, and when it did, it came out soft and slow, as if echoing something practiced long ago. The Holloway farm, however, had started to change. In February, while other gardens lay frozen beneath inches of ice, hers had begun to bloom. At first it was just the herbs, lavender, sage, a few patches of feverfew. But by early March, pale flowers began breaking through the snow near the root cellar, and behind the barn, vegetables rose early, stubborn against the cold, as though something warm pulsed from beneath the soil. "She knows some trick," one neighbor muttered, "some old country method." But no one asked, because to ask meant getting closer, and no one in Belgrave wanted to step onto that property more than once. What disturbed them more than the garden was the lantern. It used to sit still, framed neatly in the parlor window each night, glowing soft and steady. But now it moved, sometimes to the left window, sometimes to the kitchen. Once, someone swore they saw it swaying out near the tree line, flickering as if carried by an unseen hand. The priest dismissed it as wind. The schoolteacher blamed snowlight. But one girl, walking home alone after dusk, said she saw it pass directly in front of her. No footsteps in the snow, no face behind the glass. Just the light, floating inches from the ground, flickering like breath on the edge of sleep. And when she blinked, it was gone. But the warmth it left in the air felt like something still watching. David Lorne had delivered mail through 3 winters without fail. He was the kind of man who knew every bend in the road and every door in town by the sound it made when it opened. Dependable, quiet, and unshakable, even in deep snow. When he left the Belgrave post depot on a grey morning in late November, no one gave it a second thought. He was carrying the usual, holiday parcels, end-of-year ledgers, and 2 letters from Montpellier marked urgent. His route took him past the Holloway house, as it always did. And that's where the trail stopped. 2 days later, his horse was found tied to a birch tree along the edge of Holloway's field, calm, unharmed, covered in frost. But the mail satchel was missing, until a boy gathering pine branches spotted it half buried near the old stone well behind her barn. The leather was torn wide open, and its contents had spilled into the snow like bones from a broken rib cage. The letters were soaked and shredded, ink bleeding across the paper like veins. One envelope had been ripped clean in half. The others had vanished. When asked, Holloway said only this: "He passed by, I'm sure, but I never saw him." No one asked twice. The sheriff walked the property, but he didn't knock. He circled the well once, looked to the barn, and then rode back into town with his mouth drawn tight. The official statement blamed poor visibility and fatigue. "He must have taken a wrong turn," it read. "Likely succumbed to the elements." But not everyone believed that. One of the post boys pointed out the satchel had been deliberately placed, folded, not dropped. The torn pages looked cut, not chewed, and no one could explain how the horse ended up tied, calmly, at the farthest point from the trail. The boy was told to keep quiet. And still, the lantern glowed. By now, the town had counted 4 disappearances in under 3 months, all near the same stretch of road, all last seen near that same flickering light. But to act meant accusation, and to accuse meant proof. Belgrave had neither, so they waited, and the well stayed open. They were the Carraways, Jonas, Miriam, and their 2 daughters, Emma and Lottie. They weren't from Belgrave, just passing through on their way to the southern counties where Jonas had family and a promise of land. Their wagon was well stocked, the horses healthy, and despite the gathering storm, Jonas insisted they could make it across the ridge before nightfall. The general store clerk remembered them clearly. Miriam had bought extra matches. The girls had stared at the snow with wide eyes, asking if bears ever walked through the middle of the road. They left just before dusk. The storm rolled in an hour later. They never made it to the next town. 4 days later, the wagon was found tipped against a frozen tree stump a mile west of Holloway's property. The horses were dead, ribs sunken, tongues blackened with ice. Blankets still lay inside. A doll, half buried in snow. 1 boot. But no sign of struggle. No blood. Just 4 people gone without a sound. The snow showed no tracks leading away. Only the slow drag of something heavy pulled from the back of the cart toward the edge of the trees. And nothing after that. The sheriff questioned Holloway. She opened the door as she always did, perfectly composed, as if the frost hadn't touched her skin. She admitted they'd stopped by, said she gave them water, let them warm their hands by the fire. "They left before dark," she said, smiling faintly. Storm hadn't come yet. No one asked what she was cooking when they arrived. No one asked why no tracks led away from her home. No one asked how her porch stayed clear through a blizzard. That spring, while most of the town struggled to pull root vegetables from half-thawed mud, Holloway's garden erupted in full bloom. Pale flowers in tight, unnatural spirals, carrots thicker than a man's wrist, vines that curled like fingers through her fence. When asked how she managed it, Eleanor only said, "The ground's kinder when it's full." One neighbor claimed he saw her barefoot in the soil, whispering as she worked, hands buried deep in the earth. And later, when his own child asked why the flowers swayed even without wind, he answered without thinking, "Because they're listening." The woods behind the Holloway house had always been dense, but now they felt wrong. Hunters who once relied on the eastern trails began turning back without firing a shot. No tracks worth following, they'd say, but their eyes told a different story. Dogs that once bounded eagerly into the brush now whimpered at the edge of the ridge, tails between their legs, refusing to cross into the trees. One animal collapsed outright, while its owner called out Holloway's name near the fence. It had to be carried home, whimpering all night as if something had followed it back. The priest started locking the church doors before sundown. The children, once curious about the lantern, no longer dared to play in that direction. Even the men at the tavern, who'd once mocked the rumors with whiskey-soaked bravado, now whispered when the name was spoken. The disappearances had stacked too neatly. The warmth of her hearth no longer comforted. It suffocated. Then came Elijah Rusk. He was 21, worked night shifts at the mill, and walked home the long way to avoid the main road. One night, just past the turn by the hollow, he paused to relieve himself near the tree line and saw something he'd never forget. In the field behind Holloway's barn, lit faintly by moonlight, Eleanor was dragging a sack across the frozen ground. It was large, heavy. Its shape shifted with every pull, limp and formless, like something recently broken. She didn't struggle with it, just moved steadily, barefoot, white nightgown fluttering in the wind. He said she didn't look rushed. She looked calm, intentional. She reached the cellar doors, opened them, and vanished inside. Elijah ran. He didn't stop until he reached the church, pounding on the locked door, demanding to speak to the priest. He told him everything. The dragging, the sack, the bare feet, the open cellar. The priest placed a hand on his shoulder and told him he was tired. That winter plays tricks on young men walking alone. The next morning Elijah tried to find the tracks again, but the field was perfect, untouched, flat, as if it had never been disturbed at all. His name was Merritt Baines, a traveling peddler known across 3 counties for his charm, his quick hands, and his refusal to fear anything with a pulse. He sold combs, ribbons, pocket watches, sharpened knives, and once bragged about staying the night in a barn where 2 men had hanged themselves the year before. "Ghosts don't scare me," he liked to say. "Only taxes." When he arrived in Belgrave just after the first snow, his mule cart jingled with brass and tin and good fortune. Locals warned him, careful but firm. "Don't take the east trail," someone said. "Storm's coming. Nothing out there but bones and fog." Merritt only smiled. "I'll take the Holloway stretch. I hear there's a widow out that way who leaves her lantern on." He left before redusk, and he was never seen again. His mule returned 2 days later. It wandered into town just before dawn, reins dragging, eyes wide and glassy. A ribbon was tied to its bridle, bright red, too clean for the road. Merritt's cart was gone. His wares never surfaced. Some thought he'd been robbed. Others said the mule had spooked in the storm. But the saddle was dry. The hooves weren't cracked, and there were no cuts on its legs. It hadn't been running. It had been released. Someone asked Holloway if she'd seen him. She blinked slowly and said, "He asked for directions. I told him the ridge would be dangerous." He smiled and moved on. No one challenged her. But one girl, 8 years old, said something strange. She told her mother she saw a man's coat hanging on the line behind Holloway's barn the morning after the storm. It flapped in the wind, long, dark, and unfamiliar. The mother told her not to speak of it again. 3 nights later, a boy collecting firewood near the ridge found a small wooden box nailed to a tree. Inside was a silver button, a pair of cracked spectacles, and a handkerchief with a single word stitched in red thread. Merritt. The box was still warm to the touch, but the snow beneath it hadn't melted at all. Jonah Baines wasn't like his younger brother. Where Merritt smiled, Jonah watched. Where Merritt charmed, Jonah calculated. He didn't sell things. He counted them, kept ledgers, balanced numbers down to the penny. So when Merritt failed to show up for their planned rendezvous at the Chester's Bluff crossroad, a meeting he never once missed in 12 years, Jonah knew something had gone wrong. Not maybe, not possibly, definitely. He traced his brother's route backwards, asking at way stations, inns, trading posts. All trails led to Belgrave. After that, silence. He arrived on a pale morning. Skies hung low with the threat of snow. The townsfolk met him with tight smiles and downcast eyes. No one wanted to talk. No one claimed to have seen anything. Except one stable boy who mumbled, "His mule came back without him." Jonah didn't waste time. He mounted his horse and rode east. The Holloway house stood like a wound stitched in wood and stone, half swallowed by frost. The lantern flickered behind the glass as he dismounted. He didn't knock right away. He circled the yard first. From behind the barn he saw it. A narrow path to the woodpile, still fresh, footsteps pressed clean into the snow. And beside the stack of logs, half buried in slush and ash, was a brass button. Jonah picked it up without a word. His breath caught in his throat. There was a deep scratch across its face, identical to the one Merritt had always fiddled with during nervous conversations. It was his. Now Jonah knocked. Eleanor answered. Polite. Still. Calm. She claimed she hadn't seen anyone for days, said storms kept most travellers home. Her eyes didn't flinch when he asked about Merritt. Her hands didn't shake. She tilted her head, smiled and said, "I'm sure he's just behind schedule." Jonah didn't argue. He turned, mounted his horse, and rode back toward town, the button clenched in his glove like a sex. Rhett, that burned. He didn't go to the inn. He didn't write a letter. He went straight to the sheriff's office and dropped the button on the desk. "Something's wrong out there," he said. And this time, for the first time, the sheriff didn't look away. Sheriff Alden Crow had worn the badge for over 25 years. He wasn't a man who startled easily. He'd pulled men from frozen rivers, broken up knife fights over stolen pigs, and buried more townsfolk than he could count. But as he turned that scratched brass button over in his hand, Merritt Baines's button, he felt something he hadn't in years. Shame. Because deep down, he already knew what this meant. And he'd known it for some time. This wasn't the first missing person. This wasn't the second. This was the 7th. And Crow had let it happen. He sat at his desk long after the oil lamp had burned low, staring at the old trail maps, tracing the routes that always passed one house. Her house. Eleanor Holloway. The quiet woman who smiled too long, who never changed, who never aged, whose garden bloomed early, whose chimney never slept. Crow had been to her doorstep 3 times, knocked once, never looked in the cellar, never pressed too hard. Because to press would mean finding something, and finding something would mean dragging the whole town into it. The kind of horror Belgrave wouldn't survive. But this time, someone else was watching. Jonah Baines wasn't going away, and Crow had run out of excuses. So he did what men like him never want to do. He asked for help. By sunrise, a quiet search party was formed. No townspeople, no talk. Just the sheriff, Jonah Baines, one trusted deputy, and the priest. They left without fanfare, lanterns cold and rifles loaded. No warrant, no announcement, no plan beyond seeing for themselves what they had been pretending not to see for too long. As they rode toward Holloway's Ridge, the woods felt still, not silent, still, like the trees were holding their breath, like the snow was listening. The house came into view slowly, through the fog, smaller than it looked from a distance, but sharper, meaner. The lantern glowed in the window, as always, as if it had never gone out. Crow dismounted. For the first time in his career, he didn't feel like a lawman. He felt like a man about to knock on the devil's door. The door opened without a sound. No creak, no resistance. Just the slow groan of air shifting in a place that hadn't welcomed strangers in years. Sheriff Crow stepped in first, lantern raised, rifle slung low. The others followed close behind. The Holloway house was quiet, but not abandoned. That was the first thing they noticed. It was too clean. The parlor rug had been and swept recently. The curtains were drawn but dust-free. A tea set sat on the table, one cup half full, still warm. A fire crackled softly in the hearth, burning wood that smelled faintly sweet, like herbs and something underneath it. Something sour, metallic, too thick in the nose. No sign of Eleanor. They moved slowly through the rooms, calling her name once, twice, then not again. Her bedroom was neat, too neat. A book lay open on the dresser but hadn't been touched. Her closet was full, every dress hanging perfectly spaced. But no shoes were missing, no coat gone from the hook. And yet, something was wrong. The heat from the fireplace didn't reach the air. The light from the windows didn't touch the corners of the room. Time felt wrong inside that house, too long, too still. It was Deputy Arlen who found the hatch. In the kitchen, beneath the braided rug near the stove, he noticed a groove in the floorboards. He pulled the rug back and found a square outline in the wood, iron hinges rusted but intact, and a single iron ring set into the center. Crow knelt and lifted it. The hatch gave way with a wet crack. Something inside had frozen, then thawed, then frozen again. The smell that rose up from the dark wasn't rot. It was older than that. It was earth, salt, rust, and something else. Something that felt like it had been waiting. Crow raised his lantern and peered down. A narrow staircase dropped into pitch black. Stone walls. Damp. The wood along the frame was slick and sweating, and in the silence that followed, they all felt the same thing. This wasn't a basement. This was a mouth. And they had just stepped into its throat. The stairs groaned beneath their boots as the men descended into the dark. The air turned sharp, like stepping into an open grave. Damp stone walls pressed inward, lined with mildew and thin roots that curled from cracks like veins reaching for warmth. Sheriff Crow's lantern cut a narrow circle of light, and with every step, that light showed more than anyone wanted to see. The cellar was deeper than it should have been. Too deep for a farmhouse, too smooth, too deliberate. Someone had shaped it, not dug it. Cold sweat gathered on the priest's forehead, and Jonah Baines had stopped breathing through his nose entirely. It wasn't rot that hung in the air. It was something older, something preserved. Shelves lined the walls, crooked, hand-built, soaked through with damp. And on them sat jars. Dozens. Some fogged with condensation, others coated in a thick, sticky grime. A few were clear enough to see what floated inside. Pale slivers of something organic, rounded, boneless shapes that looked almost human. An eye, a finger, the curled curve of something fetal, flowered, ting in cloudy fluid. The deputy turned and vomited in the corner. Crow didn't speak. He moved forward. At the center of the cellar stood 5 wooden crates, nailed shut, edges stained dark, the kind of dark that doesn't dry out. Crow knelt beside the first one, pressed his ear to the wood. Silence. He reached for his crowbar. The iron split the lid with a sickening crack, prying the wood upward 1 inch at a time. Inside was a girl. Small. No more than 10. Her dress was spotless. Her hands folded neatly on her chest. Her hair brushed and tied with a red ribbon. Her lips were sewn shut. So were her eyes. Black thread, thick and uneven, pierced through soft skin with violent precision. Her feet were bound together at the ankles. Her fingers were curled around a dried flower, pressed flat like a keepsake from some long-dead garden. She hadn't been thrown in there. She'd been arranged. The priest whispered something under his breath. Crow looked at the other crates. All of them were labelled. Not with names, but with dates. This wasn't storage. This was a collection. Crow didn't speak as he opened the next crate. His face had settled into something colder than shock, colder than rage, just a kind of knowing. Inside was a man, arms folded across his chest, eyes missing. Not removed, just absent. The sockets were filled with cloth. His coat had been carefully sewn shut from throat to waist, as if holding something inside. He was clean, shaved, fingernails trimmed. Whoever put him there hadn't wanted a body. They'd wanted an exhibit. The third crate held 2 children, arranged to face one another like they were still whispering secrets. Their mouths were packed with dried lavender, as if to keep their last breath from escaping. The fourth, Jonah stopped Crow before he could open it. He didn't say why. He just pointed at the handwriting carved into the lid. The date matched the week Merritt vanished. And then came the sound. Soft, sharp, hollow. A knock. From inside the last crate. All 4 men froze. No one moved. Not at first. Crow stepped forward, knelt, pressed his ear against the side. Another knock, followed by 3 quick scratches. Then silence, then a whimper. Jonah shoved past him, hands trembling, fumbling with the crowbar. Nails snapped as wood cracked open, and beneath it, curled, half-conscious, wrapped in torn canvas, was Merritt Baines. Still breathing. His eyes were swollen shut, lips split from cold, wrists bruised from rope. But he was alive. When he saw Jonah, he began to cry. But no sound came out, just breath and blood and something that might have once been a name. They pulled him out gently, laid him on the floor, wrapped in a coat. His skin was covered in circular burn marks. His tongue was split, but he clutched something in his hand. A ribbon. Red. Just like the one on his mule. He hadn't let it go. "She said I was too loud," he rasped. "Said the others didn't like noise." He was the only one who'd ever come back from Holloway's house alive. And now he'd seen what none of them could ever forget. Behind them, the other crates stayed quiet. But the cellar had only just begun to breathe. The deeper they searched, the clearer it became. This wasn't a madwoman's tomb. It was a system. The cellar extended further than expected, branching into narrow alcoves carved cleanly into stone. Every corner was arranged. Every object had a place. There were hooks along the walls, thick iron ones bolted into the foundation, some still holding what looked like belts, restraints, or bundles of stained cloth. One hook bore a rosary twisted tight around itself. The beads darkened with something that hadn't been water. Beneath the hook stood a long wooden table, its surface notched and carved with lines that didn't match any tool marks. Shapes, runes, unfamiliar symbols burned deep into the grain, as though by branding iron or blade. On the far wall was a ledger, handwritten, dozens of pages, each entry dated, each subject labeled not by name but by type: merchant, male, soft-spoken, useful. Child, defiant, disposed. Clergy, still praying. The notes were clinical, detached, a record of purpose. One page had been torn halfway through, the ink smeared violently, as if the pen had kept writing after the hand no longer knew what it was saying. The priest opened a locked cabinet and gasped. Inside were preserved artifacts, tiny shoes, strands of hair tied with twine, a jar of teeth arranged by size. Beside them sat a row of jars, labelled in the same handwriting: sleep, quiet, hunger, ash. Beneath them, something else. Scraps of clothing stitched together like a quilt, but when held up, the shapes revealed sleeves, collars, infant lace. Holloway had made her own tapestry from what was left behind. This was never rage, never panic, never chaos. It was rhythm. Structure. A woman who knew exactly what she was building and how to maintain it. The jars, the crates, the silence. Every victim had a place. Every silence had a rule. She was curating it, Crow muttered. Not just killing them, keeping them. Jonah didn't respond. He was staring at the wall. There, etched beneath a rusted lantern hook, were dozens of tiny scratches, days, maybe weeks, carved by fingernail or blade. Beneath them in shaky letters, she counts us. She listens. She writes it down. And beside it, something fresher, a handprint. Still wet. Still warm. The handprint was still wet when they heard it. Footsteps. Not echoes. Not creaks from old wood. Footsteps. Above them. Slow, deliberate, pacing across the parlor floor. 4 beats. Then silence. Then 4 more. Sheriff Crow turned sharply toward the cellar stairs, lantern swinging. Jonah rose, eyes wide. Even Merritt, half-conscious, barely breathing, tried to speak, lips parting in panic. She was upstairs. She had been here the entire time. Crow motioned for the others to stay. He climbed first, boots hitting each wooden stair like drumbeats in the dark. The parlor was empty. The fire had gone cold, and the shadows from the window cut the room into sharp slashes of light. The door hung open, not wide, but just enough. A breeze pushed through the gap. The lantern was gone from the windowsill. He stepped outside. Snow had begun falling again. Slow, heavy flakes that muted sound and blurred the trees into pale ghosts. The others emerged behind him, Jonah holding Merritt's weight with both arms. At first there was nothing. No sign of her, no sound. But then Crow saw them. Tracks. Barefoot. Pressed clean into the new snow leading away from the house. Deep and unmistakable. They curved around the barn, past the old well, and vanished into the trees with purpose, not panic. They followed. The tracks wove between the pines, through brush, across a narrow ridge where the wind cut like knives. She never stopped, never stumbled, never looked back. Her prints remained steady, evenly spaced, as if she knew exactly where she was going. And then, abruptly, they stopped. Right in the middle of the Stillwater River. The ice was unbroken, solid, no cracks, no hole. Just a single set of footprints leading onto the surface. And nothing else. Crow dropped to one knee, ran his hand across the frozen sheet. It was cold, dry, undisturbed, as if she had stepped onto the river and vanished into the air. There was no way across. No sign of her turning back. No sign of her at all. Behind them, the woods moaned under the weight of the wind. And the men knew. They hadn't chased her away. They had let her go. Sheriff Crow never filed a report, not a real one. The official record marked Merritt Baines as recovered under duress and listed the Holloway cellar as uninhabitable. No details, no descriptions. Nothing about the crates, the jars, or the ledger of the dead. Because when the men returned to Belgrave, they understood what needed to be done, what the town would demand without ever asking. There would be no trial, no formal accusation, no exhumation of guilt, only silence. They sealed the hatch with iron and wood, poured lye down the steps, nailed shut the door, then nailed it again. Someone etched a cross into the boards. Someone else salted the threshold. But no one spoke while it happened. And no one ever asked what had been seen inside. Not at the tavern, not in the church, not even across kitchen tables after dark, because to speak of it was to bring it back. And the only thing Belgrave feared more than evil was admitting they had let it grow in their own yard. There were no graves for the ones they found, no funerals, no names read aloud. The bodies, those that could be lifted, that hadn't begun to come apart, were buried in a shallow pit behind the chapel. A priest said a single prayer. Then the dirt was packed down, and no marker was left. It wasn't out of disrespect. It was desperation, as if naming the dead might wake them, as if the town itself might splinter under the weight of acknowledgement. Eleanor Holloway was never found. The sheriff rode as far as the Stillwater froze and found nothing. He searched both banks, looked for drag marks, broken reeds, blood on the ice. There was none. Only silence. Eventually, He stopped looking. They all did. Her name vanished from the census the following year. A fire swept through the courthouse in '76. The marriage records were lost, the land deeds scorched. No one tried to rewrite them, because in Belgrave, the swear was always the same. Forget what you saw. Forget who she was. Forget what lies beneath. And above all else, do not ask why the cellar was built so deep. The town didn't just forget her, they erased her. With no trial, no burial, and no body, Eleanor Holloway became a problem too large to carry and too dangerous to name. Within weeks, the sheriff's reports vanished from the ledger. County census rolls were refiled without her name. Birth and death records from the year of her disappearance were either burned in a clerical fire or quietly misfiled, never to be found again. The house was struck from property tax maps. Her land was never resold. No one ever claimed it. It simply ceased to exist on paper, as if the earth itself had swallowed it, along with everything beneath. The church ledger followed. Her marriage to Thomas was inked out, line redacted, dates smeared by ash or wet fingers. Even the gravestone for Thomas Holloway, once a modest marker beneath the pines, was gone by spring. Nothing left but disturbed soil and moss. When children asked who had lived in the rotting farmhouse on the ridge, their parents told them, "No one lived there. It's just an old ruin. A mistake." But the land didn't forget. No matter how carefully the town scrubbed her from the ledgers and walls, the trees remained tilted away from the old foundation. The well remained dry and choked with dead grass, and the cellar, though sealed with iron and stone, hummed faintly in the cold. Dogs wouldn't go near it. Birds refused to nest in the trees closest to its mouth. And some nights, only in deep winter when the wind ran low, people claimed they saw a glow beneath the snow, as if something pulsed in the earth just under the frost. In 1911, a field team surveying for a new logging route uncovered a piece of wood buried in frozen soil not far from the edge of Holloway's old property. It had been flattened and warped by time, but the carving on it was still clear. It wasn't a name, it wasn't a date, just 3 words, gouged with the tip of a blade, deep and deliberate. They're not gone. The worker who found it refused to finish the job, said he felt something breathing behind him even though no one was there. He left that night and never came back. Years passed, but the land never healed. The Holloway farm, once neatly kept and oddly fertile, began to rot from the roots upward. Trees that bordered the property twisted toward the sky at sharp, unnatural angles, as if they'd grown up trying to lean away. Grass refused to grow near the foundation. The soil turned soft in summer and froze solid in spring. Birds flew in wide arcs around the area. Insects wouldn't touch the ground. The house itself finally collapsed under a heavy snow in '89, its bones splintering into the earth like something trying to crawl back in. No one came to clear the ruin. The town said it was cursed, then pretended it didn't exist. Children still dared one another to find it. They never got close. Those who tried spoke of nosebleeds, migraines. One boy said he heard his name whispered beneath his face. Yet another claimed to see a woman walking barefoot in the field, dragging something behind her that left no trail. The sheriff, long retired, refused to go near it. "She's gone," he'd say, gripping his tea too tight. "She's gone. Let her stay gone." But even he didn't believe it. Then, in the winter of 1924, a farmer following a lost calf stumbled near the edge of the woods and noticed something strange. The stone well, which had been sealed with iron and collapsed timbers nearly 50 years earlier, was standing open. The cover, which once weighed nearly 200 pounds, had been slid clean to the side, as if lifted by invisible hands. Snow surrounded the well in a perfect circle, untouched and smooth, except for one thing. A single footprint. Bare. Small. Pressed so precisely into the snow, it could have been made moments before. But there were no others. No trail in or out. Just the one, beside the well, as if someone had stepped up from the dark and stood for a moment, listening. The farmer left the calf behind. He didn't speak of what he saw until his deathbed, and even then all he said was, "The earth let her out." He paused, and I think she left it open for someone else. By the 1930s, there were no more living witnesses. Crow was gone. Jonah Baines died in a southern county under a different name. The house had collapsed, the well was sealed again, and the earth had frozen over so many winters it seemed to forget. But the people hadn't. Not really. Fear has roots, and in Belgrave they ran deep. Children were raised on stories they weren't supposed to repeat. Warnings without names. Rules without explanation. Never stray past the ridge. Never follow lights in the snow. Never speak to anyone who smiles for too long without blinking. The word Holloway became poison in the mouth. Unsaid, but understood. Parents didn't tell their children what had happened. They didn't have to. It was in the way they locked their doors before dusk, in the way they crossed the street near the old trail, in the way they flinched when the wind passed too low across the pines. Teachers stopped assigning local history. Church sermons avoided the subject of evil without form. It wasn't censorship. It was survival. But forgetting isn't the same as escaping. It began again with the lantern. Not in a window this time, but out among the trees, just beyond the ridge, flickering, moving between trunks as if carried by an unseen hand. A red glow that pulsed like breath, sometimes still, sometimes swinging. Children dared each other to chase it. Most never did. But one boy did. His name was Owen, 11 years old. Curious, quiet. The kind of child who didn't cry when scared. He told his mother he'd seen a light in the forest. She slapped him before he could finish. That night, he disappeared for 3 hours. They found him at dawn, standing barefoot in the field just west of the old foundation. His eyes were open. His mouth was closed. His hands were covered in dirt. He wouldn't speak for days. When he finally did, all he said was, "She counted me. She said I wasn't ready." He never explained. He never would. And behind him, pressed into the frost near the old collapsed house, were 2 sets of footprints, both small, both barefoot, one leading in and one leading out. She was 92 when the truth came out, thin as wind, half blind, and counting days by the sound of birds at her window. Mabel Langston had lived her whole life in Belgrave. She'd been a girl when the Holloway rumours first started, a young mother when the cellar was sealed, and a widow herself by the time the sheriff retired in silence. Most had assumed she knew nothing. Most were wrong. On her deathbed, Mabel asked for the priest, not because she feared hell, because she feared what might be left behind. Her voice was soft but steady, and the story she told made the room colder. She said it was during the second winter, the year of the Caraway family's disappearance. Snow was falling, heavy and loud, and Mabel had been up late with a sick baby and a sleepless heart. From her kitchen window, across the white stretch of field, she had a perfect view of the Holloway house. She remembered seeing movement behind the barn, a shape, something long being dragged. She lit a lantern, stepped onto her porch, and raised the light. And that's when she saw her. Eleanor Holloway, barefoot in the snow, nightgown soaked at the hem, dragging a body face down across the frozen yard. One arm bent awkwardly, head lolling to the side. A trail of blood curling behind like spilled ink on silk. Mabel didn't scream. She didn't run. She simply stood there, frozen. And then Eleanor stopped, lifted her head, looked straight at her, and smiled. Not startled, not angry, just recognition. A slow, deliberate smile that held no apology and no hurry, as if she already knew Mabel wouldn't speak. And she didn't. Not then, not ever. "I thought if I said it out loud," Mabel whispered, "it would mean she knew me, that she'd remember my name." The priest asked why she was telling it now. Her answer was simple. She was kind enough to spare me. But she saw me. That smile. It wasn't a warning. It was a promise. And just before her breath failed, Mabel said one last thing. "I think she's still waiting. And she remembers who kept her secret." In the summer of 1972, 3 students from the Vermont Historical Society came to Belgrave for a college thesis project. Their aim was simple: to document unrecorded homesteads along the Stillwater Ridge before the area was cleared for logging. They were warned the ground was unstable, that the trees grew too wild, that the town offered little in the way of history worth preserving. But still, they came. What they found was a corner of charred foundation, some rusted nails, a warped doorknob half swallowed by moss, and buried beneath it, a tin-lined box. Inside were 5 journals, leather-bound, untitled, pages stiff with age and something thicker than mold. The writing inside was small, deliberate, spidery. At first, the students thought they'd found a pioneer's diary, lists of crops, recipes, household supplies. But the tone shifted quickly. By the 3rd entry, the voice no longer recorded days. It recorded things. 1 page. Peddler, thin, ankles weak, heart murmur, broke after 3 nights, voice pleasant, took hands. Another. Boy, loud, hands like bird claws, trembled, tried to scratch, kept the nails. Another. Mother cried. Father begged. Neither stayed long enough to rot. Buried shallow. Will reuse space. Victims were not named, only described, catalogued like objects in a morbid museum. Every journal contained crude anatomical sketches, jawbone angles, muscle fiber illustrations, measurements of small limbs. Pages referenced herbs used for quieter sleep, and one margin contained a hand-drawn symbol repeated over and over, a lantern with an eye in the flame. They brought the journals to their professor in Burlington. 2 days later, the journals were gone. The students claimed they'd left them in the university archive. The university claimed they were never formally logged. No theft report was filed, no copies made, no scans, no pages preserved. One student, years later, confessed that the professor warned them, "You didn't find history, you found evidence, and evidence this old is dangerous." When asked why they didn't speak out, he only shrugged. "She wasn't writing a diary," he said. "She was writing instructions." Then he paused, looked over his shoulder and whispered, "And not all the journals were in that box. They say she's just a ghost story now. Something whispered on winter nights when the power flickers and the snow starts falling sideways. In Belgrave, teenagers dare each other to find the foundation. Online forums catalogue blurry photos of the well. Paranormal YouTube channels spin her tale into thumbnails and ad revenue. They call her the Lantern Widow, the Bone Gardener, the seamstress of Stillwater Ridge. But her real name, Eleanor Holloway, is almost never used. As if even now, saying it aloud might still invite her back. But folklore doesn't grow without roots. Over the last 2 decades, evidence has surfaced. Real, physical things. In 2006, a pair of amateur urban explorers claimed to find the rusted hinges of the original cellar door buried under moss and snow. They took pictures, corroded iron twisted open like a jaw. The following year, a fragment of stitched cloth was recovered nearby, patterned in a design not seen since the 1800s. A historian called it unquestionably authentic. Within a week, the fabric went missing from the archive. The stories grew bolder. One hiker said he saw a lantern in the trees, said it moved against the wind. Another, An EMT responding to an overdose call refused to enter a house near the ridge. When pressed, he claimed he saw a woman reflected in the frost-covered glass of his ambulance, standing behind him. There was no one there. But the condensation left a smudge. A face, thin, smiling. No one could explain how it got on the inside of the glass. In 2018, a local school held a Halloween fundraiser. Someone dressed as the Holloway widow, lantern and all, posing for photos with guests. The woman was tall, unsettlingly still. When organizers reviewed the footage later, they couldn't identify her. She had signed no forms, taken no breaks, left no trace. The lantern was left behind on the steps, lit, with a note tucked beneath it. She still counts. She never stopped. Now tourists ask where the house once stood. No one answers. Because even now in Belgrave, one truth remains. She is not gone. She is simply waiting to be remembered. They weren't ghost hunters, just thrill seekers with cameras, flashlights, and a desire to post something that might go viral. 2 men, 1 woman, college-aged, loud, reckless. They called themselves the Midnight Historians and uploaded weekly explorations of abandoned places across New England. Paper mills, asylums, tunnels. But this one was different. Their final upload was titled, Widow Holloway's Cellar. Found it. It begins with laughter, a quick drone shot of the tree line, a snowy trail. Then the camera dips low and swings hard left, revealing what's left of the Holloway property. Not much. Just a few stones in the dirt, a collapsed beam, and the well, choked with weeds and debris. But then, in the video's 10th minute, the girl gasps. They found a hatch. Not the well. Not a root cellar. The hatch. A warped slab of wood, its hinges exposed, iron hook still intact. Half buried beneath dead leaves and packed snow, but unmistakable. One of the boys clears the surface with a boot, then freezes. The camera catches it. Fresh scratches around the ring handle, as if someone had opened it recently. Or tried. They argue briefly. One wants to leave, the other insists. They open it. The footage jerks with static. Flashlight beams cut into a narrow tunnel lined with rotting stone. Dust spirals upward like breath. One of them descends, then another. The camera follows. The room is almost exactly how the journals described it. Jars line the walls, fogged, fractured, some empty, some not. Hooks along the ceiling beam. A table warped by damp and something darker. In one corner, the crates, sealed again. 5 of them. The girl whispers, "This isn't staged." Then it happens. A knock. Not from upstairs. Not behind them. From inside one of the crates. Soft at first. Then louder. Measured. 3 short knocks. Then silence. Then a second knock. From the wall. The camera tilts. One boy is crying. The girl is frozen. And just before the screen cuts to black, someone whispers, right beside the mic, far too close to be one of them, "You found me." That video was posted at 2:16 a.m. It was removed by 4:03. No one has heard from them since. They came with equipment, EMF readers, infrared scopes, digital voice recorders. Skeptics turned semi-believers. Paranormal teams lured by myth and the promise of evidence that could make reputations. The town of Belgrave didn't stop them. It didn't warn them either. People had stopped interfering with what the Holloway land attracted. Everyone just assumed it would take care of itself. The first team arrived in autumn. Leaves dry, trails exposed, the air thinner. They found the foundation easily, more visible now, worn by hikers, snowmelt, and time. The L was still covered. The cellar reburied. But the ground felt charged. The team's instruments picked up steady electromagnetic surges even before they powered on. Batteries drained without cause. Static filled every channel of their handheld radios. And the audio logs. Those told another story entirely. At 2:41 a.m., during a silent sweep near the eastern tree line, a recorder captured something faint beneath the wind. A hum. Soft, female, rhythmic. No words. Just a low melody, drifting just beyond the human register. Too smooth to be accidental. Too constant to be background noise. When slowed and reversed, the hum became recognizable. It matched the lullaby sung in a 1911 field recording from a Vermont orphanage. The same orphanage where 3 children vanished in the 1890s, one of whom had been adopted out of Belgrave. At 3:07 a.m., another sound, a whisper. Downstairs. The voice wasn't caught in real time. No one heard it during recording. It appeared only on playback. Female, breathy, too close to the mic. The team didn't last the night. They left before dawn, visibly shaken. One member refused to return for their equipment. Another was hospitalized with night terrors 2 weeks later. Their footage was corrupted. Blown pixels, looping frames, voice files that refused to stay deleted. Every attempt to clean the audio resulted in the same distortion. A high, rising tone layered with something behind it. Words no one could fully decipher, until one technician enhanced a whispered segment recorded near the well. 5 seconds of silence. Then the phrase, "She counts down." The team disbanded a month later, but every year new ones arrive, and every winter the humming starts again. Not everyone in Belgrave believes the stories, but no one truly disbelieves them either. That's the peculiar thing about trauma when it's shared. It doesn't vanish, it just sinks lower. Like a bell with its clapper removed, the memory remains intact, but silent. When psychologists first studied the town in the late 1980s, they found something unusual. Interview after interview yielded little more than vague shrugs, forced smiles, and rehearsed phrases like, "There's nothing to tell," or "That's just old nonsense." But physiological responses told a different story. Elevated heart rates, sweaty palms, eyes that flinched at the word widow. One researcher, Dr. Elaine Rudder, called it collective protective erasure. The idea that the town had not simply forgotten Eleanor Holloway, but had constructed an emotional firewall against her, not because they didn't believe in what she did, but because they did. And belief has consequences. Rudder's findings were never published. Her notes were pulled by university administrators after she submitted her final paper. Unofficially, she was told to cease all attempts to diagnose a folklore, but her private journal, leaked years later, included a final line scribbled in red ink. The town eye isn't haunted by her, it's haunted by the knowledge they let her live there. Locals, when they do speak, say things like, "The land went bad," or "She was just one of many," as if assigning the horror to the soil or to history is easier than naming her. Those who remain close to the ridge know better than to speak her name. And those who moved away carry the shadow of her in other ways. Paranoia, insomnia, a lifelong fear of basements or lanterns or sewing thread. Because facing it, facing what she did and what the town did not do, means facing how evil doesn't always come with fire and chaos. Sometimes it smiles at the market, offers you tea, keeps its garden perfect. And when that kind of horror plants roots, denial is the last wall left. Belgrave didn't bury her. They buried the mirror she held up to them. And deep down, they know. If she walked back in tomorrow, carrying that same lantern and same smile, they might let her stay again. They've argued over her motives for more than a century. Historians, occultists, psychologists, amateur sleuths, they all offer explanations. None of them agree. Some say she was mad, that the loss of her husband shattered her, leaving behind a woman clinging to order through unspeakable ritual. Others believe she was born that way, quiet, calculating, untouched by the moral heat that keeps most souls warm. But those explanations only scratch the surface. They try to cage her in common madness, and Holloway never operated in common terms. Then there are the darker theories. That the killings weren't random, that the journals weren't ramblings, they were blueprints, and that the cellar was not a grave, but a vessel, a mouth, an altar. Some believe the runes carved into her table matched pre-Christian burial codes, that her repeated use of red thread and honey root had symbolic meaning, preservation of the spirit, silencing of the will. One fringe researcher claimed her victims were selected for specific traits, left-handedness, musical ability, birth order, that it wasn't blood she was collecting, it was balance. Others leaned toward revenge. A quiet war against the town that ignored her, belittled her, watched her waste away after her husband's suspicious death. Perhaps her smile masked the slow, cold construction of retribution. But that doesn't explain the meticulous records, the formulas, the dates carved in iron. Revenge rarely keeps notes. The most disturbing theory is this, that it was neither revenge nor ritual, that Eleanor Holloway was studying something, learning, curating, perfecting the removal of agency, the undoing of personhood, that every crate was a failed experiment, every journal a refinement, that she wasn't trying to destroy the human soul, she was trying to extract something from it. And, some believe, she never finished. A document recovered in 1998 et al., attributed to an anonymous researcher, claimed she used the phrase Phase 2 in her final journal. That phrase has never been verified. The journal itself has never surfaced. But the idea has taken root, that all of this, every disappearance, every arrangement, every silence, was practice, a preparation for something larger, something no one was ready for, because what she did was monstrous, but what she meant to do still hasn't happened. The site remains untouched. No markers, no fencing, just trees growing in warped directions, the faint foundation lines like bones barely pushing through the skin of the earth. Belgrave's expansion stopped short of the ridge decades ago. Roads curl away from it. No streetlights reach the trailhead. No new construction pushes past the line where the original farm once stood. No one claims it's forbidden. It just is. But the signs return anyway. Visitors still come. Paranormal bloggers, amateur historians, travelers with a taste for the macabre. Most leave disappointed, saying it's just woods and rocks. But not all of them leave quietly. Some lose time. Some lose direction. One man walked in for 15 minutes and came back 3 hours later with a nosebleed and a missing boot. Another posted online that his GoPro stopped recording, but somehow captured 4 hours of audio after it was turned off. The file ended with static, then humming, then a whisper. Look up, and then there's the photo. Taken in early spring, just before dusk. A tourist from out of state, hiking alone, snapped a shot of the collapsed ruins, more for the gloomy aesthetic than any ghost hunting interest. She uploaded it that night, casually tagging it Forgotten Places. It wasn't until someone zoomed in that they noticed it. A shape. In the highest window frame of the old house, where the second floor had long since caved in. A face. Not detailed. Just enough to see the outline. Pale, angular, and unmistakably watching. Not blurred by motion. Not lost in the grain. Still, focused. Smiling. The original post was removed within 48 hours. The woman later said her phone was acting wrong, saving photos in the wrong folders, crashing apps when she tried to delete the file. Eventually, she reset the phone entirely, but she never went back. Her final comment on the thread simply read, "I didn't notice her at first, but she saw me." And the house, though crumbling and hidden, hasn't sunk any further into the ground. Some say it's because the earth won't take it. Others say it's because someone still lives there. She was never caught. No shackles ever touched her wrists. No courtroom heard the name Eleanor Holloway. No confession was ever taken. No grave was ever dug. She vanished into the cold like vapor, and Belgrave let her go. Whether out of fear, denial, or something darker, the town sealed the cellar and buried the truth, not under soil, but silence. And yet, the story refuses to end. The cellar remains, maybe deeper now, maybe quieter, but still there, beneath roots that won't grow, beneath trees that lean away, beneath snow that never quite settles right. No matter how many records are burned, how many whispers are hushed, the signs keep surfacing. Footprints in untouched snow, a humming that drifts through radio static. A face, just for a moment, watching from glass long since shattered. The past doesn't forget, and neither does she. Each generation tells itself it's safer now, that the evil is behind them, that monsters wear fangs, not smiles, that no one like her could exist again. But that's the final illusion, because Eleanor Holloway wasn't a creature of nightmares. She was quiet, polite, patient. She kept her garden neat. She cooked for strangers. And she studied the human soul like it was something she meant to unravel, not destroy, use. And somewhere, maybe in another forgotten town, maybe in the house next door, that same smile waits behind drawn curtains. That same lantern glows red in the snow. That same silence hums from beneath the floorboards. Because stories like hers don't end. They echo. And if you think this was the darkest horror buried in New England, you haven't heard what they found in the seminary. Subscribe to the macabre record, where forgotten histories breathe, where silence has weight, and where the past was never dead. It was just waiting.